Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MEI ISAS panel discussion titled Beyond the Checkpoints, New Geopolitics of Arabian Seaports. This webinar is a collaboration between the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and the Middle East Institute, NUS. I am Ramita Iyer, a research analyst at ISAS. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if the participants could mute their microphones when other speakers are in conversation. Today, we are delighted to have with us three distinguished panelists. Dr. Hafiz Jamali, Additional Secretary, Government of Balochistan, Pakistan. Today, he will be speaking in his capacity as an academic and not on behalf of the government. We also have with us Dr. Yusuf Al-Bulushi, EPCM Operations Interfaces Head, Petrofac, Oman, and Dr. Mohsin Soldus, the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. The session will be chaired by Dr. Ameem Lutfi, Research Fellow, Middle East Institute, NUS. I now invite Dr. Amit Ranjan, Research Fellow at ISAS, to deliver his welcome remarks. Dr. Ranjan, please.
Thanks, Ramita, for introducing the panelists. On behalf of ISAS and MEI, I welcome the panelists and other participants in this panel discussion on Beyond the Chokepoints, New Geopolitics of Arabian Seaports. The Strait of Hormuz is an important route to carry trade from the Middle East to different parts of the world. In 2018, Saudi Arabia shipped nearly 6.4 million barrels of oil per day via the strait, while Iraq sent more than 3.7 million, the UAE about 2.7 million, and Kuwait over 2 million. Any minor disturbance or political turmoil in the region can affect such supply. Primarily to protect its strategic and oil interests and of its allies, the US's Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. In recent years, to avoid high dependence on the old ports in the Middle East, through a sizable foreign investments, infrastructures have been built in Oman, Pakistan, and Iran. Modern ports at Duqm, Gwadar, and Chahbahar are likely to move the global and regional politics beyond the choke points in the region. This panel discussion will explore the broader implications of this possible shift and address many relevant questions on choke points and new ports. I look forward to get enlightened about the region and about the choke points from this panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amit, for the opening comments. Now, without wasting time, I think we would proceed to our speakers. Each speaker would have about 15 minutes to speak, and at the end of when each of the three have spoken, we'll have, I'll say, a few remarks, and then we'll open up to the floor to question and answers. So we'll start with Dr. Hafiz Jamali, who, in addition to who's an anthropologist right now, working with this very closely related to the Cpec projects. Dr. Hafiz Jamali, if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Ameem, and my colleagues at the Middle East Institute and South Asia Institute at NUS for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important conversation. As Ameem, as our introducer, moderator said at the beginning, I'll be speaking in my capacity as an expert, but as the proverbial, saying goes, you can take a person out of the bureaucracy, but you cannot take the bureaucracy out of it. So part of it, it's a part of the sort of the slides that I'm going to show, and things I'm going to talk to you about, may appear a bit bureaucratic to you. So let me begin by offering some preliminary remarks, and I'm going to share my sort of couple slides here just by way of orientation, not meant to and okay, is this one? Okay, let me make sure that I got it right.
Yes, we can see it.
Is it visible, Ami?
Yes, it is.
So, I first of all, I must sort of, beg the pardon of my colleagues. I'm not a security analyst primarily. I'm an anthropologist, an anthropologist of infrastructure, I am relatively new to this discussion of choke points and, the lack of the choke points. So, I'll speak a bit to it, but also sort of to the more anthropological side of it. So Gwadar, well before the start of the ambitious China-Pakistan corridor and infrastructural developments, Gwadar was an important node, in the maritime commercial circuits of the Indian Ocean under both Portuguese and Omani, rule. Here's a map. You can see Gwadar, right close to the on the Makan coast, close to the Iran and Pakistan border. And here is an overview from the Mount Batel of the Gwadar town, and it's you can see it's a semicircular base, beautiful place. So well before the start of this new geopolitical rivalry of port building in the Indian Ocean, Gwadar was an important harbor town which was under Omani rule for well over 200 years before it was eventually returned to Pakistan through a mutual treaty of friendship between the two other countries of Pakistan and Oman. Since at least the 2000s, Gwadar has been a linchpin of Pakistan's strategy to project its economic and commercial power into the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. The port and its allied infrastructure were built at a cost of $248 million with Chinese assistance, of course. The port operations were initially awarded through a competitive bidding process to the the Port Authority of Singapore, but they weren't able to operate it profitably, so it was handed over to the China Overseas Port Holding Corporation in 2013, and they have been managing the operations of the port. Although the port itself is an asset of the Gwadar Port Authority, the GPA, which is an attached department of the Maritime Affairs Ministry of Pakistan. Gwadar received a significant boost from the inauguration or start of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor because it is the terminus for a number of trade routes converging on Gwadar. It is still undergoing expansion. There is another sort of $1.6 billion are expected to be spent on building additional terminals. Currently, it is capable of admitting ships of approximately 50,000 deadweight ton, but over time, it is expected that it will be able to handle other ships, of 70 to 100,000 deadweight tons. And here's a glimpse of the activities at the port. That's the Chinese liner COSCO docking at Gwadar with container cargo. Here's another cargo of urea that was unloaded earlier at the port. So, port is operational and it is in, the traffic is at the moment is limited, but, it's, well on its way. And just to sort of give the broader sort of context to this issue, it is, of course, most of you must have seen this map. It's the ambitious BRI program of government of China, which and Cpec, you can see, it's almost in the middle of the map. You can see Cpec, and you can see the terminus of Cpec at Gwadar. So that's sort of the way it is configured. So of course there is a maritime dimension to Gwadar as a port in the broader sort of Indian Ocean strategy of Pakistan, China, and other countries on the Indian Ocean rim. But we should bear in mind that it is actually it is a terminus of a land bridge. Cpec can be conceived as a land bridge between China and Pakistan, which basically sort of goes over the Karakoram Himalaya mountains, in the north. And another sort of misconception about Gwadar that, is even I felt was was sort of evident from the questions that were put forward for discussion is that somehow it is exclusively a Chinese port, or there's also been a lot of talk that I've seen in security circles, that it is somehow, it's a way of China projecting its influence into the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Sea region. Well, all countries influence things, but the nature of influence is always different from case to case. In the case of Gwadar, it is conceived primarily and solely, I would say, as a commercial port. Its operations are commercially, based, and Gwadar does not actually have any military or strategic military dimension to it. And the reason is simple. Pakistan has a naval base, the Jinnah naval base, which is about 200 kilometers from 250 kilometers from Gwadar at Ormara. So Pakistan already has a fully fledged, very strong naval base on the Makran coast. And that's why, Gwadar port's primary purpose is not military, it's commercial and economic. And Cpec itself has been sort of described erroneously many times as as having a strategic or military dimension. It has an economic dimension and economic strategic dimension, but it's a broad, sort of a deep and very broad, kind of cooperation, umbrella cooperation. And Gwadar port forms one part of it, an important part, but only one part of it. Which is primarily has to do with its role as a trade and transshipment hub, and you can see that, yellow thing, yellow box there, which mentions it. Other components of Cpec, energy, infrastructure, industrial cooperation, you can see them there. So it's a very broad, sort of initiative, Cpec, between China and Pakistan, whose primary dimensions are economic and not military at all. That's why it's called China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So you can see, for example, out of the total committed amount of US $50 billion, almost $35 billion projects are devoted to energy sector. You see the orange sort of line there. And then, another 10 to 15 billion dollars are devoted to, road and rail connectivity, within Pakistan and between Pakistan and China. And then obviously there are SEZs being built. There's Gwadar Free Zone itself. Then we have the SEZ in near Karachi, the Dhabeji, and then we have near Quetta, the Bostan SEZ. So the broader, and this is sort of an official map of, the spatial planning of Cpec, and you can see that, Pakistan under the Cpec has been divided into various, economic zones, and Gwadar sits at 2 of these economic zones. So the broader sort of idea behind Cpec is to leverage connectivity, infrastructure, and connectivity through building ports and roads. You can see in the map, there are 3 different axes of Cpec. There is the eastern alignment through Multan and Lahore. There is the central alignment, through DG Khan, and then DI Khan, and then there is the western alignment, through Quetta, that all of them converged. All of these 3 alignments of Cpec, they are highways and railroads going to be being built around them, will converge at Gwadar port. So the idea is to leverage infrastructure development, availability of large supplies of energy, cheap energy, for industrial development and industrial production, in Pakistan, because China intends to shift a significant portion of its industrial capacity to Pakistan, as part of its ongoing, diversification strategy. So the primary idea is to leverage industrial geographical connectivity for industrial and economic development. That's the heart of Cpec. And here are some glimpses of the projects. These are the projects in Gwadar. You can see the new state-of-the-art business and trade center, the port, the expressway being built. There is a modern airport, which will be capable of holding hosting large aircraft that is being built around Gwadar. And here's sort of a map of that connectivity that I was talking about, So you can see it's part, and Cpec itself is a part of the broader strategy of Pakistan for regional connectivity. So if you look, so there are pointers to our neighbor India, for sort of to the Kokrapar Munabao route. There is a planned rail link to strengthening the existing rail link with Iran and Turkey to promote trade there, and of course to Afghanistan and Jalalabad, to promote trade with Afghanistan and Central Asia. So it's and this is a glimpse of the sort of many energy projects that have been undertaken under Cpec, and you can see it's a broad mix of power projects. There is coal, there is solar, there is wind, there is hydropower, which is being done. And again, sort of it's the level of cooperation goes beyond Cpec itself. This is an image of China-Pakistan, Iran-Pakistan pipeline, which unfortunately sort of has slowed down a little bit because of the invocation of sanctions and the harsh rhetoric employed by the Trump administration. And all of this has brought, obviously it has led to some conflict, in the region, and there have been attacks on security forces, Pakistani security forces, by ethno-nationalist militants in Balochistan, and to counter those, there has been a heavy security deployment in and around Gwadar to protect this economic asset by Pakistani authorities. And this is another picture, again a picture of a recent attack in Gwadar that took place in Gwadar, and two of the security guards at the local hotel, the Per Continent Hotel, were martyred in that attack. So there is an element of sort of certain ethno-nationalist Baloch ethno-nationalist groups trying to sort of who are opposed to Cpec, and they have been sort of targeting security forces in and around Gwadar for some time. I don't know, that was a basic introduction. Maybe I can sort of speak to these issues later, but I want to flag them that, so first of all, I think if I go to the idea of connectivity, I want to emphasize that when in the talk here, in the questions that were put forward, it was implied that it will take, how it will affect the choke points in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. My sort of broader concern is that when we speak of globalization or connectivity, there has to be greater cooperation and trade and understanding among various countries and nations in the region itself, for these newer initiatives, for these newer ports to prosper. So for instance, within South Asia, because of various sort of conflicts between India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka and other, Bangladesh, etc., the volume of regional trade within South Asian countries is not that great. If you look at the Persian Gulf region, again, because of historic rivalry between Iran and some of the Gulf Arab countries, the volume of intra-regional trade is actually, and the extent of intra-regional is actually not that great. So my sort of concern is that for these ports to prosper, to moving away from the chokehold of as you have spoken of the Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, there has to be some kind of a turnaround in terms of the relations and the nature of increased trade between for example Oman and Pakistan, between UAE and Iran, between sort of these countries. It cannot be that these countries each sort of are standing on their little port and thinking that they will be able to attract commercial traffic to that port, while the rest of the region is somehow not as integrated or as well connected. So that's sort of my broader argument, and then if there is time later, I will come back to some of the local issues that are specific to Gwadar as a result of this kind of infrastructure development. But I think I'm running out of my time, so I don't want to take up my colleagues' time. Maybe we can take these issues in the later part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hafiz, for really setting up the talk and reminding us about how no port can sustain by itself, and it only works if it is in relationship with other ports. So with that, we go into a port close by to Dr. Yusuf Balushi, who is going to be talking about the Duqm port. Dr. Balushi.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Hamim. Thank you, NUS and Middle East Institute for this organizing of this talk. Actually, following to my colleague speaker, Dr. Hafiz, I'll be focusing into Duqm, and my topic, I divided it to talk about three main points, which is, first of all, the context, or the main context of the economic and political position in Oman after the change of the leadership, which happened last year. And then I'll go in deep to discuss, about Duqm port and Duqm around projects and how that is reaching and developing. And then we'll go to the regional political situation at the moment after, with all changes that are happening. So, as everyone assume aware, in early 2020, there's a big change happened in the country by the change of the leadership, a long-standing leadership, HM Qaboos bin Saeed, and he was succeeded by HM Haytham. And I'm bringing that to the table because the main philosophy and the approach of the leadership, I think it's moved and deviated a bit from being political centered to be economical centered. And that's we can look into it from two different points of view. Either it is the gradual development, the normal development that we have. The country realized that they have to start, cutting the fruits of all political positions they were in earlier, and try to facilitate that economically. And as well, from the other side, due to the heavy economic, tough situation we are facing in Oman, due to the big debt, which is, as stated recently, about 20 billion OMR, which is around $46 billion maybe, and with a very scattered, flattened organization, which was in the government. So that brought a big challenge to the new leadership to look into how to optimize the country's economies and to look into the financial situation, because it's really it was warning the red light. So starting from there, HM moved to look for, or the leadership moved to look into what are the opportunities available. The debt, as I mentioned, it is top the roof. There is no any more room to go there. That's immediately took the political position to be really vital to look the solution to be politically to come away from the economic situation. And I think as well, as I said, the new leadership, it's not, their approach is not centered politically. So therefore, we can see immediately start, harmony within the GCC, and I'm talking from Oman side to them. So there's discussion started from last year, close discussion with UAE, close discussion with Saudi, where we were not finding the same in the recent 5 or 7 years from the earlier leadership's time. And I think that because maybe there were different point of view happened, especially after Arab Spring. Therefore, the earlier leadership, took a side from being involved and engaged. But the current leadership, we can see that's totally different. There is an engagement happening, and that's starting, even though, to help and support as usual into resolving some of the political tensions in the region, and mainly Oman's involvement in Yemen's resolution. And we can see, especially these weeks, the last couple of weeks, a lot of discussions happening, flights and high officials from Oman, they were in Yemen 2-3 days back. And even those, how Saudis is supporting Oman's movement toward being Muscat, the host of that solution, which we were not finding this language from different parties, especially from Saudi and UAE, from the other party, in the past 3-4 years. So there is a movement toward a harmony and a closure relation, where when you will think about it, yeah, Oman will support them politically, but the only outcome which Oman can get out of that, it is the support toward their economic situation. Going from there as well, 2021, it is the first year of implementing the big vision of Oman, which is Oman 2040, which was headed in the drafting stage by H.M. Haytham himself. And when that happened, immediately there's a big thought and a big belief that the new leadership, since they designed and planned this vision, they will drive it through. But with the current, COVID situation, or the health situation across the globe, and as well as I say, the economic situation, it seems that vision in the first now 6 months, it's not taking off from the ground so far. Needs a lot of work. It needs a lot of reorganizing within the system itself. We can see last year there were a shuffle and restructuring of the ministries and the cabinet. Still, I think the resourcing part of the restructuring happened. Now the legislative part of that restructuring, which will align with the restructuring of the resources, is really vital to take off this vision to the second level. Still, that's not there due to a lot of social and social issue, which is really evolving the country into internal political disturbance a bit. But when I mentioned now Oman 2040, this is the main indoor to our Duqm talks, where Duqm is a key pillar in Oman 2040 vision. And in Duqm, there's 2 things. One, the port of Duqm, but the second point of it, second part of it, it's not, Duqm, it's not a part. There is a special economic zone, which is behind the port itself. It is the largest economic zone in the Middle East, with 2,000 square kilometers. Already the government spent around $8 to $9 billion in the infrastructure down in Duqm economic zone. The government expenditure was mainly into the ports, and they build more than, it's two ports, mainly one for the heavy industrial port, which is port of Duqm, and there are some fisheries, other ports for other industries, which are like fisheries as well built there. The main, model which CZ, which is the special economic zone of Duqm, which CZ built on, it is the multiple business and multiple business strategy. This 2,000 square kilometer, they are divided into 8 main areas between heavy industry areas, medium industry areas, low industry areas, so on and so forth. As well, we can see, there's a slight change, or there's, a big change happened in their strategies to go toward the hydrogen and the green energies, because they, CZ area, they found that, there are mainly 4 to 5 main criteria to be suitable globally to be one of the hydrogen molecule area, where the main criteria were to be a windy, solar area, as well access to water, to use the hydrogen out of the oxygen and so forth, and as well to have access to the port. And there are just, 5 to 6 main places in the globe which are considered as potential areas for hydrogen and for hydrogen business. I'm not saying that the rest are not eligible, but I'm saying those are the highest 5 potential, which is Saudi, Chile, and Duqm is one of those. So we can see as well, there are a lot of potentials and a lot of boxes which Duqm is ticking. But as my colleague Dr. Hafiz, he said, and I'll take it from here. That's just an understanding about the area. But as he said, the connectivity with the others and the cooperation with the others, that which really will develop and take whatever infrastructure, either a port, either any logistic hub to be operational and effective. Yeah, we can put on the table that Duqm main advantages in Duqm, apart of being main political advantages. Yes, it's out of the Strait of Hormuz. It has the land border with the entire GCC, which I think the rest of the ports, they don't. The rest of the ports in the Arab Gulf, they don't have it. As well, I think, being GCC being one of the highest supply of the oil, with the connectivity of already some pipelines between the Gulf, that will make Duqm easily to position itself as an hub for logistics within the GCC. But having said all of that, we cannot ignore mainly the political situation which we are facing abroad, where we can see, despite having this closure within the GCC, but we are as well thinking, GCC always GCC countries can be really a good hand for the short to mid-term. But looking to the recent past, what happened within the Gulf Corporation, we need to really think about how sustainable that support can be to Oman. Because without the sustainability of these relations and support, as well, the volatility will be very high into areas like Duqm, and that volatility, which will not be wanted or liked by the investors. As well, I think the current Yemen situation resolution, that will brought to, if that resolved anytime soon, that will brought 2 main ports as well to the picture, despite if they are out of the Strait of Bab al-Mandab, but there's a big support will be to port of Al Hudaydah down in Yemen, which will be potential competitor to a Duqm, as well. I mean, the investments or some influence of Chinese, which is happening in Africa's southeastern African's ports, as well. Those are considered in our, should be considered in the eyes of Duqm port. We can see that Oman, the larger, in the larger picture, especially toward Africa, they are trying to get into some partnership with China, at least to have some influence and cooperation level with Duqm. I think as well. I mean, before going to that side of the geographical location, which is, Africa is considered mainly as a bigger nowadays, since it's going into the development. It's a bigger demand rather than being a bigger supply at the moment, and so therefore, we need to have a hub of supplies across, Gwadar, across Duqm, and as well across Al-Hudaydah port, and all of these, if we can see, are linked to the Chinese and Iranians political, movement in the region. And at the moment, we can see all of these relations are being under discussion due to a lot of different reasons and changes happening, either due to, what we are facing as a different strategy from Biden toward the Middle East, either what we are waiting from the Iranian change in the presidency. But to be honest, what will be coming out of these discussions, that will be a play mover and a play changer. If there is a real change will happen. And to be honest, I don't want to be pessimistic, but still we cannot see that encouraging discussion are happening around, especially with the reluctance which we are indicating with Houthis and Iranians and Yemeni situation. That's not indicating any progressive discussion is happening, even though in the other discussions. And if we will be relying in all of this discussion and putting the stake of the success of our of infrastructure toward this discussion, that will be high risky. So therefore, the only way out, and I'll conclude it with the same idea which just came from our colleague, without a cooperation between ourselves, as being an independent ports, without our cooperation together and supporting each ourselves and having the strategy of cooperation competition, we cannot succeed. I think I'm almost done with my time if I did not take more, and we can have the rest of discussion later in any QA sessions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yusuf Al-Balushi, for really adding on to what Dr. Hafiz Jamali said. And we are now already seeing some similarities appearing between these ports as well, where both Gwadar and Duqm appear as part of a larger national project to increase regional connectivity. And the success of both, our speakers have suggested, depends on the degree to which these states can bring together their regional neighbors to increase regional cooperation and trade. With that, we go on to our third speaker for today, Dr. Mohsin Soldost, who will talk about Iran and Chahbahar port development.
Well, hello, good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank also the organizers for this interesting webinar, and also thank the previous panelists for the interesting presentations. So I'm going to share the screen with you here. So I guess you've got the full screen, not the one with notes.
I think so. We don't see the notes. So I think if you do the next slide, we can confirm.
All right. So, okay, so I'm going to talk about Iran's jugular vein. The Persian Gulf is known as Iran's jugular vein, and the port of Chabahar, how it matters, and how can we actually understand why it matters to the regional powers as well as major powers, great powers from other regions of the world. So the Indo-Pacific region, and we're talking about these three choke points, Chahbahar, Gwadar, and Duqm. And we can see how these three are closely actually connected to each other, and how the Persian Gulf is actually going to be connected to the Indo-Pacific region through these three choke points. And in order to understand how the politics of these choke points, and in order to understand how actually the regional powers as well as the great powers are involved in the politics of the region, I'm going to lay down this conceptual framework for us to understand a little bit better why particular actors are playing in a particular way in the Persian Gulf region, in the Pacific region. So we've got this well-known saying that the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. That's where a famous quote from Thucydides, a historical story about how actually great powers act in international politics. So the conceptual framework that, in my opinion, helps us best to understand the choke point politics is what I'm going to lay out here. We need to have a look at the concept of power as well as interest. We need to define who are the great powers. We need to understand who are the regional states. So when we talk about great powers, we are basically talking about those United States and China, the great powers who are actually competing in the region. When we talk about the regional states, we are talking about the middle powers such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and those which are not great powers in international politics, yet in the region, they are rival powers or great powers in the region. So we also have to define the interests. What are the interests of these states? We, in international politics, we do have vital interests and secondary interests. Vital interests are about any issues related to a state's security, its power, its survival, or its status in the system. States are willing to engage militarily to fight for these vital interests in order to either preserve them or enhance them on the international stage. For example, territorial integrity, natural resources are vital interests. So if we look at the regional states, it is Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. For these regional states, natural resources are vital interests. Secondary interests are those that are unlikely to affect a state's security, its power, or its economy, or its political status in the system. And states are unlikely to engage militarily in these issues. So we see that both great powers, such as the United States and China, and the regional states are willing to engage militarily in this region, basically because these natural resources are considered vital interests for both the great powers that are involved in the region and the regional states. And we also have to take into consideration that the roles that these regional states as well as great powers are playing in the region are practically or factually available for them depending on their power position and its power relative to that of other states. As I mentioned, Iran is not a great power in the international system, yet it is a great regional power in our case. So now that we know the stakeholders are great powers and the regional states, and they are all, we are talking about the vital interests, the natural resources in the region, we can also talk about the regions of the world that matter most to different states. So the regions of the world that matter to middle powers, such as Iran or Pakistan, it is their immediate neighborhood, or it is the critical resources in the immediate neighborhoods. So you might see that, okay, that's how Iran is trying to exert its influence over the Persian Gulf region. how Iran is trying to dominate what is happening in the region, and how Iran has tried to actually exert its influence, and how to play as a great power in the region in its own immediate neighborhood, and when it is just about the critical resources in the Persian Gulf. For great powers, the regions that matter to them, in addition to their immediate neighborhood, for example, for the United States, the Western Hemisphere is what matters to them the most. They've got this Monroe Doctrine. No other great power is actually welcomed into the Western Hemisphere because the United States doesn't like them to see there. So it is their immediate neighborhood, and regions with other great powers matter to them too. For example, South China Sea is one of those places. The Persian Gulf is one of those places where all these great powers are very much involved in, because these regions matter to them. Regions with critical resources like oil, it is again Iraq, in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf region. This actually adds to the categories what really matters to the great powers. And the reason I am actually laying out this conceptual framework through which we can look at what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Persian Gulf region, and the Indo-Pacific region, is that you might have heard stories, for example, about how great powers have been willing to militarily engage in these regions. This is how the United States actually is trying to control these oil fields in Syria. This is how they try actually to have their military presence in north of Iraq because of the oil. So with these theoretical concepts, it is also interesting to see that the concept of power, interest, and regional significance also matters in policymaking. So a month ago, May 10th, we had this Strategic Competition Act in US Congress. It is the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, where the US Congress is actually trying to focus on a number of issues, which is about a number of competition issues between US and China. One of them, or the most important of them, is the partnership between China and Iran. So that's why I try to define those conceptual frameworks, saying that, okay, that's how, if we are trying to understand the politics of the choke points, we have to see why these stakeholders are willing to engage and to what length they're willing to go to accommodate their interests in the region. So these are the issues that have actually constituted the US-China competition in the region. Within 180 days after the enactment of this act, it's already 1 month past, a report on cooperation between China and Iran should be drafted. And the US is pretty much concerned with what is China doing in order to reshape the current international order, how China is trying to seek to redefine international laws and norms to align with the objectives of the Chinese Communist Party, how China is trying to co-opt the leadership and agenda of multinational organizations for the benefit of China and other partners in the region, such as Iran, at the expense of the interests of the United States and its European allies. So US is pretty much concerned that China is executing a plan to establish regional hegemony over the Indo-Pacific and displace the United States from the region. And this is all in addition to what China has been doing about the island building, the issues related to Taiwan, expanding China's military capabilities, the blue water navy that China is expanding. And in the Strategic Competition Act, we saw that there was this explicit reference to JCPOA. And the JCPOA, which is also known as the Iran nuclear deal, 2015 Iran nuclear deal, was actually an agreement between Iran, P5+1, security members of the Security Council, based on which Iran tried to expand its economic commercial relations with other partners in the region, as well as great powers. So after the Iran nuclear deal, Iran decided to pursue the policy of engagement with China and India, particularly in the region. And why Iran tried to engage both China and India was because Iran could pretty much leverage, have some leverage against both of them, trying to play them off each other when there was some business deals between them. One important point was that India became interested to invest in the Chabahar port. Iran started to actually participate in India's international north-south port corridor, and the Chinese investment as part of BRI started in Iran. So the reason I mentioned the JCPOA was that, again, how the great powers politics has actually affected the politics of these choke points in the region. So if we are trying to understand the choke points, how these choke points could be actually best used by the countries, how we can expand the cooperation and collaboration between the states, we have to look at how these powers are engaged in the region. So India, as the world's largest energy consumer that imports over 80% of its oil and half of its total gas consumption, has actually kept a close watch on the impact of the 2015 nuclear deal on the global energy markets. As Iran offered competitive gas pricing, India also expressed interest in constructing a liquefied natural gas plant and a gas cracker in Chabahar port on the Persian Gulf. And this was not just for economic reasons, based on what I previously mentioned about the conceptual framework in the previous slides. Chabahar has both strategic and commercial value for both foreign investors and regional powers. It is a strategic port that, in the absence of a land route through Pakistan to Central Asia, has been considered as the Golden Gate to the landlocked Commonwealth of Independent States, Afghanistan, and has the potential to connect the business hubs of the Middle East to South Asian countries such as India and also Central Asia and Afghanistan. On the one hand, India used its investment in the Chabahar port as a counterweight to China's pursuit of string of pearls, a strategy that seeks to contain both land as well as maritime footprint of India through developing military and commercial routes such as Pakistan's Gwadar in the region, and on the other hand, used its keen interest in the Iranian oil as a leverage with other sellers, particularly Saudi Arabia. So different stakeholders in the region are pretty much using these choke points as a leverage against each other. They all would like to have a better deal for business. And for example, on China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Cpec, which is a $46 billion infrastructure program that was signed between China and Pakistan in 2015 and connects Pakistan's port of Gwadar to China's Kashgar. We saw that while China welcomed Iran's participation in the Cpec to thwart India's regional strategic ambitions, Iran also used its involvement in this China-Pakistan project as a leverage in its negotiations with India. In addition, India's decision to get involved in Chabahar was also informed by Pakistan's so-called unfriendly posture towards both India and Afghanistan. So Iran took advantage of India's interest in the infrastructure in Chabahar and oil gas investments to strike better deals with China. So see how interrelated and interconnected all these business deals within this network of stakeholders is. So in other words, Iran kept leveraging China and India's interest in investing in Iran's oil and gas industry, as well as infrastructure projects at the bargaining table with both of them. For example, there was a very interesting example that I'm just going to mention here. In early July 2020, unofficial statements from Iran came out saying that, at the time, Iran was still fully complying with the US sanctions on Iran, was expecting India to fulfill its commitment with regards to Chabahar project. So Iran's ambassador to Pakistan raised the issue of connectivity between the sister ports of Gwadar, developed by China, and Chabahar, considered by India as a counterpoint to China's increasing influence in the region. Iran pretty much hinted that it was likely that China could replace India in the Chabahar project. The desired effect of prompting India not to delay its investment was created. So within a couple of weeks, the Indian ambassador to Tehran met with Iran's parliament speaker in order to reinforce their position, boost the bilateral ties, and review the cooperation on the Chabahar project. So Iran has pretty much used all these negotiations with China and India, particularly about the Chabahar port, as a bargaining chip on the table. And I also explained how this actual investment in these choke points in Gwadar, Chahbahar, and Duqm could have these geopolitical implications for Central Asia. That's why we saw when the project between Iran and India was being signed, the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, was also present in Tehran, attending the event, trying to attract the attention of the Iranian and Indian leaders for further investment in Afghanistan. So that's how the politics of choke points are pretty much explained, as I mentioned. So we need to look at the concept of power, the interests, and how each of these stakeholders in the region, particularly in the Persian Gulf region, are trying to accommodate their interests based on their power relative to other stakeholders in the region. And I'll finish here, and then I'll be happy to answer the questions if there are any during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohsin, for giving us perhaps the other side of the coin to what Yusuf and Hafiz highlighted, that in addition to increased cooperation, what these ports might bring in also is competition within the region or competition for attracting trade. Before we open up into the question answers, I want to take a few minutes, perhaps like 5 to 10 minutes, to situate this current dynamics within a historical perspective. I've always personally found it very useful to understand any sort of new problem that comes in. If you take a look at history, you'll always find sort of similar examples, similar cases being resolved. And with Indian Ocean, the story of new cities coming to power and old cities rising is an old story. Dr. Hafiz mentioned Gwadar itself used to be in pre-colonial times and even in somewhat in colonial times, an important terminus or important hub along this larger node of Omani trade and Indian Ocean trade more broadly. And behind this fact that cities came and cities died along the coast, which for somebody who's living in old cities or ancient cities in the hinterland might seem like an odd phenomena, but in the ocean, it's a normal thing because of the very simple fact, and I'm sort of simplifying it, that the traders could have, who are very mobile people, have the option of relocating from one place to another, from one port to another, depending on which port offers them basically less taxes and a safe enough environment and some modicum of law and order or sort of a legal resource of sort. And this was the sort of the dynamics of the Indian Ocean, where you had cities coming and rising, and also even sort of other areas like Mediterranean and so on. But this dynamic somewhat started to change with the rise of the Portuguese Empire. Now we've sort of, we forget about these moments, but it was for the first time when we see that the Portuguese married the flag and the gun to the boat. So the Portuguese ships went not just as traders as early as people went, but as flag-carrying and gun-carrying sovereigns who had the right to make war when the deal did not suit them. But more importantly, what changed with the rise of Portuguese, that they were no longer interested only in building these cities and attracting trade on the basis of lower taxes and better sort of protection, but they also try to control important choke points or places along the sea where the sea sort of narrowed down, bottlenecks of sort. And by controlling these bottlenecks, they laid claim to controlling the seas at large. I mean, the Portuguese were the first to call themselves, the protectors of the free seas. It was a title that later the British inherited. The Dutch did for a while too, the British inherited. And now we have the Americans who call themselves the guardians of the free seas as well. And as part of the, the role of the guardian, they run these freedom of navigation seas program, which is to safeguard all the seas are open, which no other country is allowed to run except the US. But behind this sort of, image of free trade is the fact that these countries, or these great powers, as Dr. Mohsin also pointed out, managed to control key choke points in the Straits of Hormuz, around the Horn of Africa, in the Mediterranean, and even further away in the Pacific. By doing so, they created a certain kind of monopoly where everything that went in and came out went through these choke points. Now, the issue with these, and of course, because this seems the fact that this choke point seems so natural to us that we forget that it was a peculiar thing that came about at a certain point in time due to this marriage of the ship being married to both the flag and the cannon. This choke point politic, one of the impacts, one of the after effects of this was that because choke points are places that are easier to monitor, they're also places, quite ironically, that are easier to attack. And we've seen sort of, from the history of piracy and even from current tensions in the Persian Gulf, really, that these are places that, because they're sort of bottlenecks, anyone who's left out, or the opponents, can also lay rival claims, and they can easily sort of slow down global trade by attacking these choke points, which has always meant that these choke points have been heavily militarized zones. And they have been heavily militarized. And there's perhaps no better example of this than the Persian Gulf itself, where you have UAE and Saudi Arabia, and to some extent Iran, which are UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, which are two countries that spend the largest amounts on military imports. And this is, of course, in addition to the already present US military bases in this region. If you open up a map of the military bases in this region, you'd see almost all of there's a major concentration of military bases inside the choke point, or sort of trying to control the choke point, both in Strait of Hormuz, but even if you look towards the Horn of Africa, we see a similar situation where a country like Djibouti is home to multiple military bases. And so this choke point dynamics in many ways has been, for the past 200 years, sort of a defining feature of global politics. But what is interesting for us now, and one of the major reasons that we organize this panel, is to see sort of alternative imaginations, alternative possibilities that might emerge with the rise of these new ports. Can we perhaps see a shift towards a dynamic where you again have this rise and fall of ports, and a rise and sort of, economics perhaps taking the dominance over these kind of more security concerns? And it was interesting to note in all three of the talks that we got strong mentions of the fact that these ports themselves will not be enough. That the port, like no port in itself is enough. Ports are only meaningful as nodes in longer connections. So success of a port depends on its ability to attract a larger network. And of course, the fact that these, the simple geographical fact that these ports are no longer within the straits does not necessarily mean that they are without choke points. And perhaps with that, I want to start the question answer session with the first question, that even if even if we don't have a physical choke point in the same way as the Strait of Hormuz, it seemed clear to me from the three talks that they were choke points of different kinds in all of the three cases. With Gwadar, we see one of the major choke points being the fact that this port only functions if there is a land connectivity towards China. And with Duqm, as Dr. Yusuf pointed out, that its success dependent on the cooperations of other GCC countries. Only if other GCC countries are able to supply oil and reroute some of their traffic to this area does the Duqm port make sense. And with Dr. Mohsin's, we saw with Chahbahar, a similar situation as a bottleneck sort of emerging with, let's say, even with GCPOA or these geopolitical tensions, where only if these tensions are resolved and there's some permission that we can get greater trade. But with that, I know you three have mentioned it to some extent. I want to ask if you could elaborate, if the three of us, you could elaborate a little bit more of what you see as the major choke point, be it more metaphorically or as physically, in the success or in the rise of these three ports respectively. If we could start, we could start with Dr. We could go the other way around. Dr. Mohsin, if you want to take the first stab at the question.
Sure. Can you just state the question again?
The question. Yes, the question that I was asking about, what do you think is the main bottleneck in the success of these ports? What is the main restrict point? Like if that could be cleared, then there's sort of the choke point or bottleneck in the success of Chahbahar port.
I think it is very difficult to give a clear answer to that, because on top of the economic or the commercial value of these points that we're discussing, there are deeply seated strategic concerns of all these states. You mentioned about Saudi Arabia and UAE buying all those weapons more than any other country in the region. Saudi Arabia is a top buyer of arms in the world, not only in the region. So it is very difficult to say that even if we are staying out of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf region, whether the Duqm port or the Gwadar port could pretty much bypass that particular region so that there is less tension, I hardly believe that it's going to work, because Iran is trying pretty much to expand its navy, so that it is trying to expand its missile program, so that there is at least 2,000 kilometers within the reach of Iranian missiles. So expanding these ports, particularly if we talk about, again, the particular strategic interests of all these states here in the region, it could not be enough unless all the states in the region could actually benefit from what is available to everyone. We cannot deny these opportunities to one particular state in the region and expect that everything goes right. Even though it is outside the Persian Gulf region, even though it is not going through the Strait of Hormuz. I doubt that it's going to work if we say that, okay, we're going to, let's say, block the Strait of Hormuz, we're going to stay out of the Strait of Hormuz, and at the same time, we are denying Iran the opportunity to engage in economic activities with other states. There will be still some tensions, I would say, in the region, and given all these three ports are pretty close to Iran, and not close to Iran, even close to the proxies. We know that in the region we've got different proxies that are actually fighting for different states in the region. We've got Saudi proxies, we've got proxies working for UAE, we've got proxies working for Iran. So it is very difficult to imagine that we could have some safe routes for doing business and commerce if we are bypassing the Strait of Hormuz.
Thank you so much. Dr. Yusuf, if you would like to take a stab at the question as well, about what is the main bottleneck in the development of the Duqm port.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ramim, and thank you, Dr. Mohsen. I think from my point of view, I'll not add a lot onto the connectivity ideas, since it's really clear, but the connectivity is really vital toward how much we are connected into the three main regions, back into the GCC, up into the new ports in Asia, especially in Gwadar and Chahbahar, and down into Africa. But as well, I think the ports, end of the day, are just the interfaces to the sea. And all of these ports, should have its own up and midstream of projects and infrastructure, how they can move, either the productions, or they can have the logistics which is behind the ports itself, to support to support the added value of the port, and which is, in this case, I can see it. In the majority of the three ports which we are talking about, all of them are attached and embedded with different projects. It just depends. Either these projects, some of them are linked to other countries, where this is a real choke point, if those are, linked to other countries, and sometimes no, as long as those are really into the zones which is surrounded, like I can just remind myself of Jebel Ali port and Jebel Ali free zone, how it makes the success of being really sustainable by whatever production and links which is already they have within the UAE itself. So that's allowed them to be a bit sustainable. And I think the third point, the diversification of two things, how you can diversify the power and diversify the economic models. So we can talk about these things, business-wise, where we should diversify the production, but as well, the most important thing, diversification of the power in those lands. So we cannot have, just the US military there or just the UK military there, from the security point of view. As long as we can welcome and accommodate diversified powers into our region, that really will help their businesses and their trust to be on the ground, which will absolutely pay off as a real investment and added value to the global supply chain.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hafiz Ali.
Yes, sort of building on, and thank you for asking that very good question. And building on what my colleague Dr. Al-Balushi said earlier, some of the choke points, vis-a-vis the Gwadar port were, at least in the past, were internal to Pakistan. So as Dr. Al-Balushi said, and I will rephrase it in a different way, that a port without connectivity in the hinterland is like a marooned ship. It cannot get you anywhere, So vis-a-vis Gwadar, one of the issues with with the Pakistani planning machinery, or our planning machinery here in Pakistan, was that while the port was very quickly built, it was construction started somewhere in 2002, March 2002, and by 2007 the port was complete. But the connectivity of Gwadar, both via road and rail, took much longer. So, the sort of the utility of the asset that was created was, sort of decreased because of that. But one is sort of, the pure sort of physical connectivity that I mentioned. Similarly, in terms of energy connectivity, the Makran grid still sort of relies on, power supply from our Iranian friends. We get sort of 150 megawatts of power from Iran for Gwadar and, some other parts of Makran region. And Makran was, until recently, was not connected with the main Pakistani national grid. So there were sort of, some basic, planning problems or flaws, in, sort of the development of Gwadar port, which have now, at least under the current government, have been addressed. So there is an ambitious program of connecting the Makran grid with the broader national grid. There's a 300 megawatt coal power plant that is sort of, is likely to be completed in the next 2 years. And similarly, at the institutional level, the customs arrangement and other, such arrangements have been, made sort of brought online, so through the VBOX system. So you know, there's a physical connectivity dimensions, the optic fiber link with the national optic fiber main artery has been connected. So you know, so those link and beyond the connectivity with China itself, you know, the main Cpec eastern alignment is near completion, and similarly the western corridor, which was a demand of the local people, is also sort of near completion. So that's one aspect that is being that is being addressed. But that those ambitious energy and infra, and then of course we have the big ticket item, which is the ML1 railway line, which is sort of costing close to $8 billion US dollars, which is being finalized and could not be finalized for a long time, because the problem partly from Pakistan's perspective is that infrastructure comes at a price. It requires huge investments. Taking on a loan, even if it is a concessional loan of $8 billion US dollars, is not a joke. Is not a light step. So so many of those, for example, under Cpec, under the current government, there has been an extensive deliberation with our Chinese brothers to structure these Cpec investments in a way that reduces the debt servicing burden on Pakistani side. So that's sort of one aspect. Another aspect has been the Pakistani central government's relationship with the local Baloch people. So in the earlier part of the planning process, the original Gwadar master plan of 2003 was rather ill-conceived, I would say. It was designed by an engineering firm which had very little experience of urban planning, and the kind of changes it proposed were really not suited to the attitudes or expectations of the local population, which led to a lot of resentment. So that's another dimension on which the Pakistani government has been working. So, for example, they have come up with a new Gwadar Smart, government has come up with a new Gwadar Smart Port City Master Plan, which takes a more dynamic approach to the development of the city. And, there's a specific component of the plan which focuses on the development of the older part of the city, where most of the fishermen and other, local people live and earn their livelihood. Similarly, there were concerns about the expressway project, which was connecting the port with the hinterland. And again, the Prime Minister intervened by asking to build, passages across that, to facilitate the fishermen. The provincial government has come up with a huge investment of almost 2.5 billion rupees, Pakistani rupees, to improve the sewerage and sanitation of the old town of Gwadar. Similarly, the federal government has recently approved close to $4 billion US dollars to sort of upgrade the electricity and municipal infrastructure in Gwadar town, and availability of water. Because let's not forget that these mega projects, these large scale infrastructure projects, are kind of like elephants. They put a huge footprint on the ground and they drink a lot of water. And many of these parts, whether be it Chahbahar or Gwadar, they are like water stressed places. So the pressure. The third thing that the Pakistani government has been trying to do is to adopt a more balanced and inclusive approach to regional partners. So, for example, a Pakistani premier has visited Iran multiple times to hold direct talks with President Rouhani. Pakistan decided to commence fencing of its border with Iran to allay Iranian concerns. Right now, the federal government is embarked on an ambitious plan of formalizing the informal cross-border trade, from Iran border. So, there are at least 11 border crossings, official border crossings, planned with on the Pakistan-Iran border to facilitate, formal trade, across the two borders. And even, both countries have offered each other, and they're actively thinking of connecting Chahbahar and Gwadar via road link as well. So those are Similarly, Pakistan has tried to bring Saudi Arabia on board. Saudi Arabia, the Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Gwadar, Pakistan, and an oil refinery and oil city is planned, in the hinterland of Gwadar with Saudi assistance. In the same way, Pakistan has reached out to Afghanistan and Central Asian countries. We have recently, Pakistan is negotiating with Uzbekistan to establish a rail link, which would connect, Tirmiz with the terminus of Pakistan's main railway line at Peshawar, to make it so to allow it to use the Karachi and Gwadar ports for its, transshipment of its goods. So in the same way, Pakistan is routing Afghan transit trade through Gwadar, so the Afghan traders and cargoes don't have to wait for a long time at Gwadar, at Karachi, which is a much more busier port. So those are one of the things that perhaps is still is you could say a weak point of Pakistani strategy is to have a broader level of engagement, come up with and sort of let's not forget that this year Pakistan has also announced an ambitious development program for southern Balochistan, which is primarily directed towards improving infrastructure and livelihoods, so dams, roads, and other things for the coastal belt, so the people sort of have their grievances are addressed. One of the things that is perhaps missing from this strategy is a broader political framework, which engages different political parties, who represent those grievances of local people, into a broader political deal, which which addresses sort of issues of land rights, rights over mineral resources. Although many of those concerns are enshrined within the 18th Amendment passed by Pakistani legislature, but they have to be operationalized, and some of those things have to be elaborated, and more ironclad assurances at the political level have to be provided to the regional political parties hailing from Balochistan, such as Balochistan National Party of Akhtar Mengal, and the National Party led by the former Chief Minister Dr. Malik Baloch, as well as elements who who have been sort of involved with the ethno-nationalist insurgency in the province, whose leadership is sitting abroad. So a more comprehensive political framework, that sort of ties together all of these, efforts that Pakistan federal government has been making, to address, concerns or reservations around Gwadar, both internally within Pakistan as well as vis-a-vis its external partners. So that, I think, apart from the physical connectivity, and that to me is an effective, what you call a choke point, or an effective bottleneck, of the long-term future for it.
Okay, thank you so much. We will now take questions. So anyone who has questions can, of course, send it to me or the MEI events team, and I will read it out to you. Or if anyone so wishes, they could also raise their hand and and unmute themselves and ask the question directly as well. We have one question to begin with, and it kind of grows from the comment that Dr. Hafiz Jamali made. And it's a question from Rajesh Basru, who's a senior fellow, RSIS Singapore. He asks that there's a tendency to see choke points in zero-sum conflict of interest terms, but there are also sites of interdependent interests. This becomes clear from the recent accidental blockage of the Suez Canal, which imposed high cost to economies globally by disrupting supply chain. Is there any move to try and manage choke points through a multilateral cooperative effort? So if any of you would like to take that question about, are there any real efforts being made to build these regional or multilateral coalitions around these new ports as well? Dr. Mohsin, would you like to?
I can perhaps add a little bit about what Iran has recently proposed. For the past couple of years, Iran proposed this comprehensive security pact for the Strait of Hormuz. It's called Hormuz Initiative, trying to involve regional powers instead of great powers from outside the region, providing security for the Strait of Hormuz, for the Persian Gulf region, including these ports that we're discussing now. But the problem is that we see that these regional initiatives, or what is actually proposed by these regional powers, are not very much welcomed by other states in the region. And it is, again, because of the influence of the powers outside the region. While, for example, there is a regional state offering that, okay, we can have this security pact for us, and we can be all involved in providing security to the region. Just in February, we saw that United States actually seized this oil tanker, which was carrying Iranian oil in February. And then they took the oil to Texas. They sold the oil for $110 million. And then they gave it to, it was done under this anti-terrorism law in the United States. So we see that this, let's say, intervention in the region by these great powers is working as a major setback to any regional initiative, because this oil was actually seized on the Fujairah port in UAE, and Iran was very much unhappy with that because the UAE actually allowed that to happen. So we see that all this intervention by the great powers in the region is pretty much exacerbated the situation in the region. We have this regional somehow. I'm not saying that it is really the ideal situation, or that the initiative proposed by Iran is going to work well. But what I'm saying is that because we've got stakeholders from outside the region who are exerting their influence, and they are very much powerful, and they have effective policies that pretty much disrupts any regional pact or cooperation between the states in the region, we don't see much progress in cooperation between the states in the region. Like India was trying to invest in Chahbahar port, again, because of the US pulling out of the nuclear deal, imposing sanctions on all those countries that are doing any business with Iran, pretty much forced India to get out of the Chahbahar port, or pretty much suspended the cooperation between Iran and India. So the problem in the region is perhaps one of the major problems is that any cooperation, or let's say commercial collaboration between these countries, is highly politicized or excessively securitized by the powers that are outside the region. Otherwise, we would see perhaps the development of the Chabahar port. We could see pretty good cooperation between Pakistan and Iran. The pipeline that Dr. Jamali pointed to was pretty much suspended because of the imposition of the sanctions by the United States, which, by the way, violated the terms and conditions of a multilateral nuclear disarmament agreement, which was upheld by all parties except the United States. So these are the issues that perhaps these are out of control of those states in the region.
Thank you so much. We are running short of time, so I'll ask the respondents to be quick. We'll take, I think this might be the last question, or we can take one more. Danish Sultan asks, there's two questions. One is about what is the time, is there any timeline for the Iran, Pakistan, and India gas pipeline? And the second question is, perhaps Dr. Yusuf Al-Baluchi, you could take it, is about, is there any possibility of an intra-GCC coalition that does not necessarily always look to the West, or looks for possibly other regional partners than Europe or the US?
Okay, so I will start with the second question. I mean, what I can see at the moment, I mean, what's happening about the interrelation between the GCC, I cannot see it very, I mean, in the short to mid term, it's happening. I mean, due to two 2 to 3 main reasons. One, one way we'll see, toward the leadership in the GCC, still the sustainability is not there. There's two main leadership just were succeeded last year, and I think as well there are some potentials who might be succeeded. Any time in the coming midterm maybe. As well, I think there is no sustainability for the large powers' influence toward the GCC, where we can see, for example, Trump administration's influence was totally different than what's happening nowadays with Biden. And I think we cannot work just alone, because we are really one of the main suppliers as the GCC toward the energy to the globe. So, internationally that won't be accepted, because any independent interrelation just to work aside and apart from either other regions' power or apart from any influence from big powers, that will really impact the energy security globally. So therefore, I cannot see it's happening any short to mid-term.
Thank you. Would either of you would like to give a timeline to the Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline? I think it's a difficult question, but yeah.
If I may quickly, I think it's not possible, and I will echo, Dr. Al-Balushi's sentiment regarding the GCC, because, the pipeline, was, the profitability of, the gas supply through the pipeline originally was contingent on, cooperation between, in addition to cooperation between Iran and Pakistan, it was contingent on cooperation between Pakistan and India. And unfortunately, since the BJP government took over in India, our eastern border has consistently been a flashpoint, and I think last year, the tensions really, had reached a boiling point. So that's sort of one big span in the works. The other part, as far as Pakistan and Iran are concerned, is the issue of US sanctions. As Dr. Mohsin also pointed out, that there is the looming threat of US sanctions, because of the policy initiated by Donald Trump. So it will depend on how sort of the new US administration. Partly, it will depend on how the new US administration proceeds, vis-a-vis Iran, to enable Pakistan. And lastly, there's also regarding the Iran-Pakistan partnership, there is also a financial aspect to it, because the gas tariff in this changed scenario also has to be reworked between the two countries. So that sort of there are some minor issues there as well. Where it's an ongoing negotiation. But there are some minor issues where consensus is to be created there as well. Given the overall sort of development trajectory of Pakistan-Iran relations, I am hopeful, but we are still a long way from, sort of this becoming operational.
Okay, I think unfortunately we are out of time, so we might not be able to take any more questions. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank our three speakers for joining us today and really, enlightening us about these dynamics and sort of really pointing out, in summary, I'd say that in addition to the broader geopolitical context, what is important to also consider is the regional and perhaps even the local context in the success of these ports. So thank you to each of the three speakers. Thank you to my co-coordinator, Dr. Amit Ranjan, and thank you so much to the staff both in MEI and ISAS for working behind the scenes and making this possible. And thank you, of course, everyone for joining us and listening to us today. Have a good day and a good evening, depending on where you are. All right, thank you.